Inversions are important, and most guitar players don't really bother to learn how they work. We're going to take a minute to talk about what happens when you invert a chord. So let's write a C chord. You know, we always do this stuff in C. Get that out of there. All right, so this is what we would call a root position triad. I don't think the term root inversion really makes any sense here because we haven't inverted it yet. So we're going to call it root position. That's fairly common. To invert a chord means that I'm going to take a note that we think of as being the bottom of the chord, in this case the root, and I'm going to put it on the top. So if I rewrite this chord so that the C's on top, I have not changed the sound of this chord at all. All right, and I'm going to do something I usually don't do, which is play these examples for you. And I typically avoid that because it takes too much time, and you have nothing but time to practice these on your own. So you should be listening to the sounds of these things, but I'm going to play this for you. All right, so you can hear the sound of that chord is functionally the same, regardless of the order that I put the notes in. We said that this was a root position triad. If you take the bottom note, the root, and you move it to the top of the chord, now we have what's known as a first inversion triad. If I repeat this process of taking the lowest note in the first inversion triad, and I move that to the top so that it looks like this, now we have a second inversion triad. So with a root position, we have root, third, fifth. The root is on the bottom. For a first inversion triad, that means the third is on the bottom. For a second inversion triad, it means the fifth is on the bottom. If I do this yet another time, we're going to return back to a root position triad. It will just have been moved up an octave from the starting point. So you can do this with any chord type. It doesn't matter if it's major, minor, diminished, whatever. The process is the same. Now let's talk about a somewhat different concept that is fairly closely related to this, which is the idea of open versus closed position triads. Each one of these examples is of a closed position triad. In other words, the three notes of the triad exist completely within one octave. And there's no way that you could insert another chord tone in between any of these existing chord tones. There's no room. They're squashed together as close as they're going to get, regardless of what the inversion is. But on guitar, this is really not how you play most of your triads. Because of the way the guitar is laid out, playing closed position triads, particularly with no doublings of notes, as I've written them here, is rather uncommon. What you tend to see on a guitar, if I just put the most commonly played open C chord shape up here for you, is full of doublings, although it doesn't have any missing notes. So this is still probably going to be considered a closed position chord because you can't fit any more notes in here. There's no gaps, in other words. But that is actually not even the norm when it comes to playing bar chords. When you're playing bar chords, for example, if I change this to a C chord that uses the shape of an E form, which would be here, now you can see that there are gaps here. There's a missing note right here where the third of the chord would be. And this is a more common way to see your guitar shapes existing without necessarily filling in every one of these notes. Now, if you were learning how to play the piano, let's say, in an early stage of learning the instrument, you'd be very likely to play chords that look like these. They're closed position, and you would probably, as a piano player, be far more likely to be using inversions to a greater degree than a guitar player does. But on guitar, just because of the way the layout of the instrument works, we're tending to use open chord shapes more often than closed. All right, let's get rid of the guitar example for a minute and just talk about the concept of open and closed in the abstract a little bit more. If I go back to my original C root here, but then I put the fifth there and I put the third here, I have a functional C chord here. I've got a root, I've got a third, and I've got a fifth. And it really makes no difference whatsoever what order these notes are in. If I have a C, an E, and a G, I have a C major triad. I could put them in wildly divergent places on the neck. Now, I'm not saying you can actually play them this way, but let's say for a moment that I could play this E and this C and this G. That's still a C chord. I've still got a root, a third, and a fifth. Now, as far as its usefulness, this particular chord might not be of much use to you. Even if you had 3 hands to play it on a piano, it probably isn't going to do you much good. But my example here is extreme just to demonstrate the point that, in fact, those 3 notes, no matter where they're played, are going to give you the sound of a C chord. If you take this concept over to something a little bit out of the realm of our experience, like an orchestra, this note could be played by the cellos, this note could be played by the violas, and this note could be played by the violins, and you would still get the sound of a C chord. It has absolutely nothing to do with where the notes are played or who's playing them. Those 3 notes give you the sound of C major, period. So what we're trying to do here is really demonstrate that you can play notes in a lot of different scenarios, but the functional result is still the same. Whether we're talking about inversions, whether we're talking about the difference between open or closed chord sounds, whether we're talking about the difference between instrumentation, orchestration, arranging across an ensemble, doesn't matter. The concepts of theory still hold true. And as a guitar player, this is actually pretty useful to you, although it's not widely used or appreciated on guitar. And I think that has to do with the way the guitar is taught, the way it's laid out. It doesn't necessarily lend itself to using these things quite as functionally as some other instruments do. But if you are a guitar player that has played a lot of maybe funk or reggae, then you might be used to the idea of taking chord sounds like these little inversion groupings and moving them up and down the top 3 strings. That's pretty common. If you want some exercises in doing this, I highly recommend finding the Triad exercises from Berklee Book 2. There are a lot of pretty detailed exercises that teach you how to move inversions across a position in these closed position groupings. So good luck with that.